Esoteric Ebb is one of those games that makes a very specific promise. It wants to recreate that feeling of sitting at a tabletop with a good dungeon master. You're going to be making strange decisions, asking questions you probably weren't supposed to ask, failing dice rolls, wandering off course, and then discovering that the game was actually prepared for you to do that, and somehow it works. Hi, I'm Vadd, and in my review here of Esoteric Ebb, I went in expecting a fairly small, text-heavy RPG built around Dungeons & Dragons mechanics, and what I found was one of the better attempts I've played at translating the freedom of a tabletop session into a video game. You can ignore major objectives, you can skip around characters, you can solve situations in ways that feel like something that somebody at the table would actually try. You can lie about who you are, you can pretend your character is no longer a cleric, but instead they're the god, wizard, emperor of all things. You can spend an unreasonable amount of time asking people who they are voting for in the coming elections, and sometimes failing that dice roll gives you a better story than succeeding. That freedom is the reason I enjoyed Esoteric Ebb as much as I did. At the same time, there's also an interesting contradiction here. This is a game that is incredibly open about letting you decide what your character does, while sometimes it is considerably less open about what ideas the writing itself considers valid. That doesn't ruin the game for me, but it does matter. We'll talk about that more a little bit later in this video, but what I want you to know is that Esoteric Ebb is overwhelmingly about dialogue, characters, politics, and the decisions you make inside those conversations. I think the question here isn't really whether Esoteric Ebb is a good RPG. I'll tell you right now, I think it is a good RPG. It is a good role-playing game. I think the bigger question is whether you're the kind of person who wants to spend hours reading through what this particular RPG has to say. And that answer is going to change dramatically depending on you, the player. One other warning before we go any further. Esoteric Ebb, I think, benefits massively from going in as blind as possible, and this review will have some amount of spoilers. I'm not going to spoil major story plot developments here, but there will obviously be contextual information in the footage that I share. So if you've already decided you're going to play this, you may want to treat this review more like something to listen to than something you need to watch here, because I think discovering how this story responds to you is a big part of the fun. Hey, if this review is making sense so far, liking the video genuinely helps this video find more people looking for it. If you want to support my work more directly, there's a single pay what you want tier on Patreon, as well as YouTube channel members to help fuel future videos. Thank you. If you're new here, you might not know that I review games after completion all the time here on this channel. In Esoteric Ebb, we rolled credits, we did the side stuff, and I just want to tell you, it's not a difficult game to actually complete to 100%. It's really not, because most of your time is spent exploring the narrative, talking to people, making your checks, following your quest, just uncovering different pieces of the world. You're just going to work your way through it, and you pretty much don't miss things. Yes, there's some missable achievements for you achievement hunters out there, but it's not hard to find them. I'm going to say right up here at the start, I played the majority of my journey on my workhorse of a machine for my PC and on the Steam Deck, and technically my experience was extremely clean all the way through. Right up front, technical condition as far as that goes, I don't have anything to complain about. Everything seems to run just fine. This is a very text-heavy game. How long it takes you to finish, start to finish, is really dependent on how quickly you read and how much optional dialogue you explore. If you're someone who struggles to stay interested when you're staring at a large wall of text, I think that alone could be enough to rule this game out, because Esoteric Ebb here is going to put you in the role of a cleric. You belong to this first generation of clerics who've never actually met the god they're serving, and it's a fun little tone. You've been sent by the local government to investigate an explosion at a local tea shop because of an esoteric event. I think we're gonna, for now, call that wild magic. And this investigation of the wild magic and the explosion just gets much, much larger. There's a lot of dialogue you're gonna be reading through all the way. There's an election approaching, there's political groups fighting over what comes next, everyone is trying to convert you to their political party so you can share the good news for them. There's going to be a larger world around the smaller city you explore that has enormous wars, supernatural disasters. You have humans and goblins and dwarves and orcs and all kinds of different races that are struggling to get along inside the city. You have some really strong magic that used to exist and has started to fade, and right in the opening 90 seconds, right in the very beginning of the game, you get murdered and thrown in the river, and then your body's recovered, you wake up, and the game really starts to pick up pace. I think at a glance though, Esoteric Ebb looks like a small little game with a bunch of familiar ideas: stats, dice rolls, spells, skill checks, backgrounds, quests, political factions, dialogue trees, but I think just saying that undersells what it actually does well. Listen, Esoteric Ebb isn't impressive because it uses tabletop mechanics. Lots of games do that. I think what it does here really well is that it understands why people like tabletop role-playing in the first place, because the fun isn't always in defeating the monster. Sometimes the fun is asking the dungeon master a stupid question and realizing they actually have an answer. Sometimes you've just decided to not investigate the next main story thing and just seeing what else your character can do. You're literally avoiding main characters or main locations on purpose, and instead of this game collapsing because you refuse to participate correctly, it responds. And that's the difference here. I think plenty of RPGs technically give you dialogue options. Here in Esoteric Ebb, it is much better about giving you the feeling that the person writing the adventure actually thought about what would happen if you behaved strangely. On my first run, I purposely made a ridiculous character that had no intelligence, no wisdom, no charisma, and there were very funny and very serious consequences for that. It changed my adventure to have a strength, dexterity, constitution heavy character. I unga-bunga'd my way through an absurd number of things. Instead of unlocking a door or instead of talking my way through a door, I was punching through doors, losing my mind. And that's what I wanted from that first journey. And that's mostly what I got. This is not a massive RPG. I think the explorable area is fairly compact. There aren't dozens and dozens of companions. It's not a huge tactical combat system. And I don't think the game needs any of those things. It doesn't have them. It doesn't need them, because I think the scale of it allows it to react to you. I think for this genre of games, this style of adventure, I would rather have this smaller adventure that remembers what I did than a gigantic journey where most of my decisions slowly disappear into the world. I think the beginning hours are maybe the most confusing part, because you're trying to learn the world, how to walk around, learn some of the vernacular, right? What's an esoteric event? I told you earlier, it's kind of like wild magic, but you're being introduced to the local election. You're very early on meeting multiple different political factions. You're learning about the world. You're discovering that you've been murdered. Who killed you? And on top of all of that, Esoteric Ebb just wants you to play it. It's a game, right? And, it's pretty simple. You talk to people, you walk around, you ask questions, and you pay attention to what people are telling you. I don't want you to assume that the obvious objective is the only thing you're allowed to do. And once you kind of get that and it clicks, this game becomes very, very interesting to engage with, because your character starts to change what you actually know. My character was too dumb to read. My intelligence was so low we were illiterate, and it just changed what we could actually learn from the world around us. It changed some of the dialogue and the way people treated us. I want to be clear here, there's not always a giant dramatic dialogue option. Sometimes the game simply tells you, hey, that's not something you would be able to tell a character, and I don't mind that. I think overall the attributes you choose for your character feel more like characteristics rather than a number attached to traditional combat. Over time, you're going to start to understand the setting well enough to start trying to manipulate checks in a more deliberate way. Maybe you learn something about a subject before you attempt a difficult role, and this information can change alongside your class and your stats. Maybe you have an item that helps. You're going to go pick a lock, and you have some boots you can put on that give you bonus to lock picking. I want to contrast some of that early adventure with some of the later adventure. I don't think the later hours are more mechanically complicated. I think they're more informed. You're better at understanding how all the pieces fit together. And because this is a relatively compact game, I never felt like it completely ran out of ideas before I reached the end. Character creation is pretty straightforward. You're always playing the cleric, so you're not picking from a giant class list. Right at the start, you get to choose your basic attributes and a basic background and proficiency. There's nothing too tricky here, nothing too overwhelming here. And because you were murdered right in the opening minutes of the adventure, you discover that you're effectively rebuilding your magical knowledge as you go. There's this nice progression that's connected to what actually happens in the story. You don't start out weak because Esoteric Ebb needs an excuse to make you level up. You start out weak because you've just been murdered, maybe resurrected, separated from your equipment, and thrown into this investigation, and suddenly everyone wants to know, what political party are you part of? Who are you voting for? And over time, you're going to regain more spells, improve your attributes, find better equipment, complete some quests that unlock some feats for some permanent bonuses, and you just become more capable. For me, the best part is that these improvements aren't primarily about turning your character into a damage machine. Instead, they all give you more ways to interact with the adventure. As you journey along, you're going to receive better equipment to improve your stats, opportunities to bump your stats with your feats, and you're going to unlock more spell slots and different smells. You actually get quite a few different spells early on that you can cast. Sometimes your spells are tied to a very specific dialogue prompt or some kind of a predefined interaction, so you can't always experiment with spells as freely as you might expect. And this can make magic occasionally feel more restrictive than the rest of the game. At the same time, every time you complete a major quest, you have an opportunity to unlock a feat. I mentioned these early, but it's not just simply filling an XP bar here. Your adventure really is the source of mechanical growth. These feats are going to give you in-world tangible benefits that change your success and how you interact with the world. I think all of it's very appropriate for the kind of game Esoteric Ebb is. The world of Esoteric Ebb isn't particularly large. There's a central area with a few surrounding neighborhoods and a larger underground section. And the access to most all the places is going to depend on what you've done, what you've learned, what you're capable of, what knowledge you know from who you've talked to. It all kind of builds on itself here. At the same time, the map could be a little better. It's not bad, but if you're going to rely on a map early on, you're going to struggle. Again, the world isn't gigantic, but it winds around enough that I think your first time through in those early hours can definitely get a little confusing. Sometimes I knew what I was looking for, but I just spent more time than I wanted figuring out how to actually get back to where I was going. Now, let's be clear here. That might be my biggest quality of life complaint, and that's not really that big of a deal. Let's be honest here. This world itself is pretty darn excellent. There's so many little ideas here that made me keep asking questions. For example, what does a death penalty look like in a society where people can be resurrected? I found a character, we had a conversation about that. What happens to a religion when the god everyone's worshiping was actually recently alive, mortal, and walking around? And we found some people, and we talked about that. What happens when the people who personally knew that god are still alive? What does that look like? We found them. We talked about that. What happens to political power when an extremely powerful magic starts disappearing from the world? And we talked about that. What happens when humanity has kind of destroyed itself? There's all kinds of questions that are continually presented and opportunities to discuss them with the different characters you're going to meet. But there's also this level of absurdity to things. There's a drunk sphinx that hangs out at a bar. You can talk to an angel. You can encounter a gelatinous cube. There's trolls. There's goblin politics. There's strange magical events. And everyone has an opinion on the local election. And you absolutely can, should, and will be asking people who they vote for a lot. I think this setting overall understands that a fantasy world can be incredibly serious and incredibly stupid about 5 minutes apart. There's a balance here I think works surprisingly well between very difficult, heavy conversations and very absurd, funny moments. I think one of the strongest parts of Esoteric Ebb is player choice. This game is responsive. No, it's not infinitely responsive. No game is. But I think it's responsive enough that I was making my way through and I regularly wanted to test how it would respond. Remember, you start out as this cleric, right? You're a healer, you're a holy man, right? And you might walk up to someone and say, actually, I'm a wizard, and they can kind of look at you and roll their eyes. Or maybe you're a rogue, but you just picked a lock, so they believe it for a moment, right? Everyone wants to talk about politics, so you just start telling everyone that you're apolitical and you're not going to pick a side. Or maybe on the other end, you're enthusiastically supporting one of the factions and you're getting that XP bonus every time. Or maybe you are the cleric. Maybe you're the god wizard king. The game just rolls with it. No matter what you're choosing here, there's an opportunity to interact with the world from the position you are presenting. Remember I said the local government wanted us to investigate a tea shop explosion? This investigation changes based on what you discover. The information you get will alter the checks in your conversation. Your failures will create new outcomes, and characters do remember things, and objectives can be avoided. There's enough optional material here that I think different players can come away with a surprisingly different impression of different people. I mentioned earlier that my character was incredibly stupid, but it turns out I could still roll. I could still select characters and roll to see if I can get any insight into those characters. And sometimes I got that insight and unlocked some information that I didn't have access to because my character was too dumb to read, too uncharismatic to convince, and lacking enough wisdom to know not to say the dumb thing, right? I really do think that Esoteric Ebb creates this feeling that you're poking at an adventure and there's somebody on the other side that's actually responding. I want to talk about combat encounters, but I don't think that's quite the right word to use because I think that misrepresents what they are. Yes, they're encounters, but it's all text driven. There's these underlying rules that at first glance, if you've never played a game like this, it's going to throw you off. But you're going to roll initiative, you're going to make checks, and enemies are going to take turns. Your equipment's going to matter, your spells are going to matter, the damage will matter, and you can die. Make the wrong choice, say the wrong thing, lose the dice roll, your health drops below 0, and it might just kill you. Maybe you survive, you'll return with just 1 health point and a level of exhaustion. That exhaustion is a mechanic that reduces your maximum health and makes all of your dice checks more difficult. At the same time, encounters usually give you multiple approaches. Sometimes aggression is possible, and sometimes there's another action you can attempt. Sometimes the better answer is to try to manipulate the situation rather than try to beat something into submission. And for Esoteric Ebb, that's the right choice. It doesn't need a gigantic tactical battle system. That's not this type of game. It's much more interested in recreating the loose storytelling side of a tabletop encounter. I think the dice creates just enough uncertainty, you have just enough build options here, and your previous decisions are sometimes changing what's possible, and the narrative keeps moving. Esoteric Ebb is an extremely political game, and there's one part of the writing I think deserves its own section here because for some players this is going to matter a lot more than anything mechanically I've mentioned so far. Again, Esoteric Ebb is an extremely political game. This should not be a surprise, as it is literally the election day story that is central to the main adventure. I think politics can make a fantasy world more interesting. Esoteric Ebb can sometimes feel less interested in exploring competing ideas than it is in communicating which ideas the writers would prefer you to accept. This game occasionally gives opposing positions some basic acknowledgement, but I rarely felt as though those arguments were being given the same level of sympathy. In-game, the Asgalian Workers' Party mirrors today's Marxist and socialist ideologies, and they are often treated as morally right. The Free Striders in game represent capitalism and are often painted as clear villains. The Angel faction is a bunch of warmongering conquerors. The demons you meet are reasonable and helpful. The male characters tend toward villainy and the women are heroes. There's gender-changing potions and gender identity as a topic in the setting as well, and these are not hidden ideas. They're not simply in one obscure dialogue option buried somewhere that most players will never see. They're part of the world the writers here have created. And I'm not here to tell you what your politics should be. The reason this matters is because Esoteric Ebb is a game almost entirely about reading what these characters have to say. The writing is the gameplay, and the worldview behind that writing is part of what you're buying. And there's a distinction I think is important here. A political RPG can give you extreme ideas and also at the same time let you explore why they might fail. I think it can let you make offensive and or destructive choices. I think the game world can allow different philosophies to collide and then let you, the player, decide what you think. And Esoteric Ebb doesn't always feel interested in doing that. Yes, they are technically competing positions. There is some acknowledgement that the game's preferred ideas have flaws, but there are also moments where the narrative and even the reward structure makes it fairly obvious which outcome the game considers better. This means that some of the political choices feel less open than the rest of the role playing, and it's kind of an odd contradiction here because Esoteric Ebb is fantastic at letting me, the player, decide whether my cleric is going to investigate the murder, ignore some important political events, impersonate another class, make some completely ridiculous choice nobody sensible would make with a pot on my head. But when it comes to some of the writer's own political and social beliefs, the range of acceptable conclusions can feel considerably narrower. And for some people, this is not going to be a problem at all. You may agree with practically everything being said, or you may simply enjoy politically opinionated fiction even when you disagree with it. But for other people, this is going to be exhausting, and pretending that none of this is here or not mentioning what I observed would be misleading. If you're specifically looking for a politically neutral fantasy RPG, this isn't one. To be clear here, I'm not here to settle any of these political arguments. This is a review, and I'm here to critique the game that's actually in front of me. Esoteric Ebb makes these ideas a meaningful part of its writing, so they're fair game to discuss. And for me, this is one area where the writing feels noticeably less open than the role-playing mechanics that surround it. We'll briefly touch on the Steam Deck. It fits on the Steam Deck, no problem. I had no problem technically with the performance. The interface worked just fine. it was a fine way to journey through things. Again, it's a lot of reading, so maybe you're not comfortable doing a text-heavy reading adventure on your deck screen, but if you don't mind, it's not a bad experience at all. For me, Esoteric Ebb's biggest strength remains its responsiveness. Esoteric Ebb respected a lot of strange decisions my character made. And I think that's because it understands the part of role-playing that is testing boundaries and figuring out what the game's going to expect from you. I also think the setting is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed that the magic had kind of started to fade from the world. I like that everyone had picked a political side in their election and wanted you on their team. I really liked the discussion around humans, goblins, and the characters who remembered meeting the gods. These aren't just random pieces of lore dumped in a journal. These are all ideas the game actually uses throughout. On top of all these strong systems, there's a character system here that I think works extremely well for what this game needs. Different stats genuinely change what information you receive, you act on, and you can work with. Your spells are going to give you alternate options, your equipment can shift your abilities, preparation can change that difficulty of a check into something more manageable, and as you complete the different quests, your feats continue to make your character growth directly tie into everything you're doing. All of this reinforces the same central idea. In Esoteric Ebb, your character is defined by what they know, what they've experienced, and how they approach problems. And I think it's just fun. I think the story overall is good. The game can be silly, it can be extremely silly, but at the same time, there's enough emotional weight here that the nonsense never completely overwhelms a good story. I think the biggest weakness here might be or at least one of the biggest weaknesses is the spell system. Some spells are dramatically more useful and effective than others. I constantly found myself using the same handful of spells because they just did what my character needed. I also think the map could be and should be a little better. I like the way it unfolded as your character explored, but maybe just a setting option to say, just give me a good map, or like my character can have a map, like don't make the map unfold in front of me, right? I also didn't really enjoy the additional preparation system and the friction that created to have to prepare my spells and my spell slots. I get why that exists in the tabletop world. I understand this was inspired by some of those mechanics, but I'm not convinced that every piece of tabletop friction needs to survive the transition here into the video game. It would have been really okay just to have my spells and use them. I didn't need to be managing spell slots, short rest, long rest, finding a shrine to reset things. Just let me throw my magic around. It's a magical world. I also think the companion system was a little thinner than I wanted. Not that the companions were bad, I haven't talked about them much because I don't want to spoil anything. But at its simplest, the companions felt like extended guest characters rather than true sidekicks. Maybe you'll have a different experience, but sometimes I would send my companion away to do something that could only be done solo, and I'd forget to get them till the next day. I just didn't need them to do anything. I think it's important here to mention one more time, if you don't enjoy reading, Esoteric Ebb isn't going to magically change your mind that you suddenly do enjoy reading. You know, for me, I don't think the best version of Esoteric Ebb is dramatically bigger. I don't think it needs a giant world. I don't think it needs 25 companions. I don't think it needs massive tactical combat systems. I think the best version of this game is more confident about the systems already there. Let my spells be a little more free. Let my map be a little more free. There's a spell you can use to knock on things, but I'm not sure I ever used it. Not on my first journey. I kind of forgot about it. If you're going to give me a spell, give me a reason to use it. I've got some temporary companions that I wish we had more time to develop. And I really wish that as the story became more and more political, there was a little more trust in the players. Give competing philosophies strong arguments. Let good ideas create unintended consequences. Let bad ideas occasionally produce understandable outcomes. Don't be so afraid to let the player reach a conclusion that the writer doesn't personally share, because the rest of Esoteric Ebb is already built around that principle. The game constantly says, go ahead, try something, see what happens. And I really wish the writing had that same level of confidence. When we talk about value for money, Esoteric Ebb launched at $25 US. And I think at that price, for the right player, this is a good value. This isn't a game you're buying for hundreds of hours of content. You're probably not going to replay this one because once you've played it once through, there isn't a whole lot that you're going to do different in the main story here. You're really buying it for the density, the branching dialogue, and the alternative outcomes. You're buying this for the ability to make a different character and discover information you might not have seen on your first run. You're buying a game where a second playthrough could genuinely go differently because you decided to interact with the story in another way. I think for a lot of players, though, you don't need to replay it. I think the first playthrough I had was the most rewarding one, and it was plenty for me. I can easily see people who really enjoy this roleplay setting and at the same time go back because they really want to try a different stat distribution or path and see what changes. For $25 US, I'm comfortable with what's here. The technical polish here helps, and the Steam Deck support helps as well. The facts are, Esoteric Ebb is really for people who enjoy reading dialogue. That's the first requirement here. And I think it's safe to say that most people are going to spend at least 20 hours on their first run. There's at least 20 hours of dialogue to read through. Again, depending on your reading speed, right? But there isn't voice acting through this whole thing. Maybe that'll change in the future, but I don't think we should expect it to. So if you're thinking to yourself, I'll just sit back and listen, you're not going to get to do that here. This is really for people who enjoy asking questions and trying unusual solutions. If you enjoy building a character around personality and knowledge instead of reflexes and combat effectiveness, you're going to have so much fun here. If you're not looking to commit 150 hours here, I've got great news. There's not 150 hours of game here. You're going to explore the world, learn the systems, see the story, have a good time, and move on. And if you're highly interested in a very politically opinionated fantasy world, you've got a lot to dig in here. There's some really good conversations. This, of course, means that if you're the type of player that primarily plays RPGs for combat, this isn't what you're looking for. If you're looking for a giant party of companions traveling everywhere with you always, that's not this game. If you hate dice rolls and the possibility of failure changing your story, you're going to spend a lot of time fighting the game instead of enjoying it. If you strongly dislike politically prescriptive writing, you should know what you're walking into here. The politics and the social issues are deeply embedded in this setting. You're not going to remove them from the experience by choosing different dialogue. If you need voice acting, don't buy this. There's a good game here, there's a good story here for you to read. For some people, these things are strong selling points, and for others, it's probably a reason to play something else. For me, Esoteric surprised me. This was a relatively small journey with no voice acting, a compact world, limited companions, and encounters that happened through text. And inside of all those limitations, it works. I think it works because the developers focused on the thing that mattered most, choice. Not just the illusion of choice, but an actual responsiveness, the ability to ignore objectives, the ability to approach conversations differently, the ability to build a character whose intelligence, wisdom, charisma, background, equipment, spells, previous experiences all genuinely affected what they understood about the world and how we could interact with it. I think Esoteric Ebb really understands that the best tabletop stories aren't memorable because someone perfectly followed the adventure script. Instead, they're memorable because somebody did something unexpected and everybody had to figure out what happens next. I think Esoteric Ebb captures that feeling much better than I was expecting. It's not perfect. The map needs a little work. The spell usefulness is inconsistent. Some companions barely have time to really become companions, and there's a huge amount of reading. But none of these things erase the experience I had. I enjoyed this world. I enjoyed talking to the characters. I enjoyed experimenting with the checks, and I enjoyed figuring out how the setting worked. And I enjoyed discovering just how often this game was willing to respond when I decided to behave in a way it wasn't expecting. If you've been here before, you know how this works. I score games on the more objective stuff, the systems, the execution, the technical state, all that stuff. But the recommendation is a vibe check. When I'm done, do I actually think you should play? Esoteric Ebb does a lot of things objectively well. For me, this experience became exhausting long before the game was finished. I don't think the game needs less writing because the writing is somehow a problem. For me, I just wanted tighter writing. I still want to have the same choices and ideas intact, but I would have enjoyed the experience more if it was a little more compact. At the time of review, Esoteric Ebb is awarded a 4 out of 5. I do not recommend. How about you? How much does your personal enjoyment matter to you when a game is clearly doing a lot of things well? Let's talk about it in the comments. I'll see you there.